In this section of Renaissance and Discovery, we'll be looking at the New World empires in America. Now, Europe's economy after the Renaissance was dominated by scarcity, demand, and supply. What was in high demand, items like coffee, chocolate, tea, and sugar, in Europe was scarce, or in many cases unable to be grown, but not in America, where supply was as much as one could grow. Now, what this would do is lead to the establishment of colonies, this settlement of people in a new territory linked to their parent nation or their mother country. Now, this economic relationship across the Atlantic between Europe and the Americas will eventually lead to the global economy. Believing that wealth is fixed, that it's based on gold and silver, which is limited. There's only so much out there. You either have to find more of it, or you have to sell an item and take someone else's gold and silver. So it's limited. So believing that wealth is fixed, Europeans attempted to gain land that could earn wealth by scrambling to build American colonies to gather needed resources. So what this will eventually develop into is a new economic system known as mercantilism, a state-controlled economy where products and services available depends on the will and the oversight of the state. So the state, the country, the government there will essentially determine what is going to be produced, what is going to be grown, what the focus and the most effort is going to be put towards. So they have a humongous amount of oversight on the economy. And what this does is help them keep a very positive balance of trade, where they have more exports, hopefully, than they have imports. Again, they are selling more than they are having to buy. So essentially, mercantilism favors exports over imports. When you export something, you're selling something. You are selling to somebody else something, and you are bringing in money. So you're giving up an item in exchange for money coming in. That's favorable over imports, where you're having to import something that you don't have in your own country, and to do so, you're having to give up money. You're having to give up that gold or silver. So it just makes good business sense that you want to make sure that you're selling more than you're having to buy. So all you're doing is taking that simple business practice and applying it to an entire nation or country. That the country itself wants to make sure that it's exporting more goods than it's having to import. So how this relates to colonization is that if a state gained territory, or in this case colonies, it could import goods from its colonies and export the rest, the excess, earning profit. For example, sugar. Now, sugar is not naturally grown in the Americas, but if you had a colony in the Americas, you could grow your own sugar and bring it into your country and use it for your own purposes, whatever your state or your people needed. What you had excess, you could sell or export to countries that didn't have the capabilities of having colonies. Therefore, you're taking in their money and not having to give up any of your own. So this becomes the overall goal of mercantilism, is to establish colonial empires that benefit the state. So let's talk about these empires that these Europeans are going to be building in the Americas. So the Spanish themselves found gold and silver in Central and South America. They found it from the Indians, and the Indians eventually led them to where more gold and silver would be found. But this mining operations that were required lots of work that the Spanish lacked. They didn't have enough people in these colonies to do the work that was needed. So they began to search for a new form of labor. And this new form of labor will take the form of the encomienda, this forced labor system of natives in exchange for assuming responsibility for their health and welfare. Now, the health and welfare aspect, the Spanish only cared as much as it related to how they got their work done. So this forced labor was usually very harshly enforced, with the natives being starved and overworked. So they really didn't care about their health and welfare outside of how it related to could they get the work done that the Spanish were requiring of them. Now, over time, the Spanish would abandon their Caribbean holdings that had no gold and silver on these islands that will become the West Indies. The other Europeans, however, the English, the French, and the Dutch, will rush to establish plantations to grow profitable cash crops, these large agricultural estates there. Again, they weren't so concerned like the Spanish were with gold and silver. They figured out, well, we can use this very rich soil to grow stuff and earn money that way. So two different approaches to earning money. The Spanish were actually looking for actual gold and silver, whereas the other Europeans realized if we can grow cash crops, we can earn gold and silver through selling these cash crops. And again, on these plantations that were established, these settlers attempted to, again, use the natives for labor, but again, were too few and in many cases unreliable. The natives simply wouldn't work, or they would run away into the jungles. And so it was very hard to use the natives for labor. So the Europeans went in search of a new labor force, since the natives are becoming too few and unreliable. And that's where we lead into African slavery. Now, the desire for labor forced Europeans to look to Africa for laborers. Africans were favored due to their tolerance to European diseases, creating a need for a system to transport slaves. That's another aspect of the native population that became very unreliable, is that many of the natives died on the plantations or in the mines because they contracted European diseases, and as we saw in the earlier section, that becomes a very devastating impact on the native population. So Africans, being from the Old World section of the world, were used to European diseases and therefore didn't suffer the same kind of fate that the natives did. But however, the Europeans needed a system to transport Africans from Africa to the Americas. So from the 1440s up until about the 1830s roughly, you have the slave trade, these selling and trading of human cargo from Africa to used as forced labor, as slaves. Now, from 1444 is the first time that we see in Europe, in a place called Lagos, Portugal, the very first slave market used for the importation of Africans for forced labor. Less than a decade after that, the Pope in 1452 grants the right to reduce any type of pagan or unbeliever to hereditary slavery, which is slavery passed down through generations. So if your grandfather was a slave, your father would have been a slave, you are a slave, your children will be slaves, your grandchildren will be slaves. And this also included Europeans, Africans, and even natives. Anybody who was seen as a pagan or unbeliever could be reduced to slavery. Now, it won't be until 1518 that we have the first documented event of the Spanish ship carrying the very first Africans from Africa to America, and carried on ships much like the one you see pictured there. Now, on these ships, they wouldn't be put on the deck typically. A lot of times they were held in the cargo holds, as you see from this diagram here, of kind of how these slaves would be kind of laid end to end along the entire length of the ship in the cargo holds. In many cases, 500 to 700 slaves. And occasionally, groups of them will be brought up to the top deck to get fresh air. A lot of times only half of them were fed. They were starved many times. Any that died, they threw them over the board. In many cases, when they ran out of enough food to feed all that they had, they would slowly get rid of them by simply throwing them overboard and drowning them. So just very horrible, horrible conditions that these Africans had to suffer on their forced journey from Africa to the Americas. Now, what made it easy for Europeans to reduce Africans to slavery is that in many cases for Europeans, they saw Africans as inferior to Europeans, simply because they lacked European civilized culture. And eventually Africans were seen much more like property, like you would see livestock or a pet, rather than people, which would eventually increase their use as a trade good. That you would trade them and buy them like you would do cattle or horses. And this buying and selling and trading of Africans to do work in the Americas will eventually lead to this humongous trading network that we call triangle trade, which was a way of correcting trade imbalances between Europe, Africa, and America. From Europe to Africa, the Europeans would sell rum, cloth, and manufactured goods to the Africans in exchange for slaves. Now, one thing that many people don't realize is many of the African slaves that were brought from Africa to the Americas were already slaves in Africa. So when we say that Europeans were trading with the Africans on the coast a lot of times had their own slaves, their own African slaves. They would conquer their neighbors or other tribes in Africa and sell their enemies into slavery. So those African tribes on the coast would take in rum, cloth, manufactured goods from the Europeans. In exchange, they would go out and hunt their rival tribes, their enemies, and capture them and help Europeans capture them and sell them into slavery. So many of the slaves that the Europeans picked up, they were already slaves in Africa. It wasn't that they were being forced into slavery by the Europeans themselves. The Africans themselves were enslaving other Africans and selling them to Europeans. Now, from Africa, those slaves would make their way to the Americas in what we call the Middle Passage there from that diagram that you see here. It is the Middle Journey, where in some cases 700 slaves were put on a ship. That could be as little as 300, as much as 700. Many times what they left with in Africa is not what showed up in America, as I said earlier. Many were thrown overboard when they realized they had too many. And from the 1500s up until the 1800s, at least 10 million Africans made this journey from Africa to the Americas. Once they arrived in the Americas, they were traded and sold, and that money was used to buy up things like cotton, tobacco, lumber, and sugar, the raw materials that Europe needed. And so those raw materials would make the final journey from the Americas back to Europe, completing this triangle, hence why we call it triangular trade or triangle trade. So using this system of triangle trade, each was able to fix trade imbalances. Europe had an excess of manufactured goods, but they needed the raw materials. So they got the raw materials from the Americas. The Americas had an abundance of raw materials, but they lacked the labor there to extract those raw materials. So they got the labor from slaves from Africa. Africa, of course, had an abundance of slaves that they could sell to the Europeans, but they lacked manufactured goods. So they got the manufactured goods from Europe. So as you see, all the trade imbalances, what was needed and what was in excess, was exchanged on this triangle. Using this, some European nations became successful, others did not. So let's talk about the success in the New World. Now, the Spanish led exploration of the New World, starting with Christopher Columbus back in 1492. But the Spanish didn't prosper as much as the others. And the question's always been, why? They had this huge colonial empire. They owned pretty much all of South America outside of Brazil, and North America pretty much from where is now the current United States south. They owned almost an entire continent, really. How were they not so successful as the British, the French, and the Dutch will eventually become? Well, one reason is pirates of the Caribbean. Literally, pirates that would board Spanish ships coming from Mexico back to Spain, carrying gold, carrying silver, and they would be robbed of their goods. And so many of those pirates were English pirates. For example, one of the most famous ones is Sir Francis Drake, who was known for raiding Spanish ships. Another reason is the lack of excitement. Mexico and the Caribbean and South America, this region that the Spanish pretty much heavily occupied, was a very dangerous place. You're talking about pirates constantly traveling the water, so you don't know when you're going to be attacked. This is also a place that has very severe storms like hurricanes that come through, so a lot of wind damage. You establish a colony, and then come summertime, it could get destroyed by hurricane winds. So not a lot of people were excited about going to the Spanish colonies. Not a lot of families were traveling to the Spanish colonies. It was just too dangerous. And lastly, mercantilism really kind of does it in for the Spanish. And what we mean by that is that the Spanish were so concerned with gaining gold and silver, but they never used it. So they have this money, but they never invest it. They never do anything with it. So if you're sitting on all this money, but you never use it, is it really useful to you? Are you really able to do anything if you're never willing to use it? So the Spanish were so concerned with gaining money, this mercantile system of where they control what's being done in their colonies, which is essentially just find gold and silver, that they never find a way to make any profit from that other than just gaining the gold and silver. Now the Dutch, however, do a little bit better. They're the first to explore the eastern shore of America, near Long Island and the Hudson River that you see blinking here on the map here. Now, eventually they will establish a colony there at the mouth of the river called New Amsterdam. but later on that colony will be overran and seized by the British, who will rename it New York. Now the French, on the other hand, are the first to explore and settle around the St. Lawrence River area that would eventually become Canada. And where the French made their profit from there is through fur trading, which was extremely profitable in Europe. However, many of the animals that they hunted for their fur were slowly becoming harder and harder to find in Europe, but in the Americas, they were abundant. And to make things a little more interesting here, this, unlike the Spanish, required the French to have very friendly relationships with the natives, because the French came in as traders. They would trade with the natives things like blankets, things like pots and pans and utensils, in exchange for the Indians, the natives, to go out and hunt the pelts of these animals that they wanted. It was much easier for the natives to hunt these animals because they knew the territory, they knew the land, they knew where these animals would be better than the French. So the French and the Indians had a very much more pleasant relationship than, say, the Spanish and the natives. Now lastly, the British here, the British had a large trading empire around the world, and will expand that empire to the New World along the east coast of North America in 2 separate colonies. The first of which, in 1585, is the Virginia colony, or the Southern colony. This is the first English colony in the New World, established at Roanoke, there on the Carolina coast. Now, this colony will become unsuccessful once the ships that dropped them off and established the colony fail to return to the colony in time. They are held up by a war going on back home between the Spanish and the English. So they are held up there and not able to return in a timely manner. By the time they do return, they find the colony abandoned, and it becomes known as the Lost Colony. But the British try again. In 1607, the English establish Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in America, which will prosper thanks to 2 men, John Smith and John Rolfe. John Smith will bring military order to the colony. When he first arrived there, the colony was almost about to fail. The people were starving. There was not a lot of law and order. So he brings pretty much a dictatorship role to the colony, establishing principles like he who does not work does not eat. Many of the people that came to Jamestown were looking just to make it rich and weren't really willing to do the hard work of maintaining the colony and providing for the colony. So when he shows up, he basically becomes a military dictator of the colony and puts in law and order and really helps to stabilize the colony. Now, John Rolfe, on the other hand, introduces tobacco, something that for a while only the Spanish had control of. But once he brings tobacco to Virginia, he finds that the soil is very, very fertile and that tobacco grows extremely well here. And so tobacco becomes a huge cash crop for the British here. Now, in 1620, the Plymouth Bay colony is established. It is the northern colony. It will become the second permanent English settlement in America. And it's not established for economic reasons like Jamestown, but for religious reasons by the Pilgrims who are seeking religious freedom. We all know the story of the first Thanksgiving and the Pilgrims. This is that colony. Now, this colony will eventually become part of what's known as Massachusetts colony, with its center there at Boston there. Now, as you can see, you have a northern colony and a southern colony, and as we said earlier, eventually the English will close that gap by conquering New Amsterdam and turning it into New York. So in closing, European nations built these trading empires in the New World that gave birth to the new global economy that stretched across the Atlantic, made possible by establishing colonies there in the Americas with enforced labor to help harvest the raw materials and goods that the Europeans needed. And to think all of this started with one man simply stumbling across the New World.